Okay, so now I've got my workspace set up. I have my newspaper underneath. I have a water basin off to the side of my work area that is approximately maybe a little less than halfway full. I also have my 3 paint bottles out in my 3 primary colors, and then I have a paint palette, my paintbrush, and I have some paper towels. So then I know I'm ready to start as long as I have all those supplies out. So the first thing that I'm going to do is fill in my primaries because those are already pre-mixed, so I don't have to mix them myself. So before I use the paint, I'm going to want to make sure that the lid is closed. So I can tell the lid's closed because the white is right up close to the red cap. So I'm going to shake it before I actually open it, just in case the paint's been sitting a while, then the color won't be exact. So then I'm going to twist just the white part of the paint. So I'm going to make sure I'm not twisting the red cap. If I twist the red cap, that's taken off the whole entire cap. So I'm just going to make sure I'm twisting the white. So I can see the white, there's a gap there now, so I know it's open. Occasionally, if our paints have been used and there's some dried up paint on the edge, the dried up paint might crumble and kind of fall in your workspace. So just be aware of that. So then I'm just going to place a little bit of paint in my palette, in one section of my palette. So it's a very, very small amount of paint. You definitely don't want to be going, filling up this whole space up to the side. You just want a little dot in the bottom. You can always add more if necessary. So I'm going to be painting in my red section, and I'm just going to be holding on to my paintbrush like I hold on to a pen or a pencil. And the proper way to hold a paintbrush is to hold it on the metal section, which is called the ferrule of your brush, so that you have some good control over where you're painting. The farther back you tend to hold a brush, the less control you have of being able to stay in your lines. So you're definitely going to have more control over the brush if you're holding on the metal section. And one thing you're going to notice on the way I paint with this brush is I am using a swipe motion. So I'm just swiping down with my brush, picking it up, and then swiping down again, and then occasionally moving it left to right as well. That's the right way to use a brush. The other correct way to use a brush is to paint back and forth. So you could do back and forth. You generally, with a small space, using a swipe is more convenient. So it's a little bit easier. I am going to grade you on staying in your lines, and using that good brush control will help you to stay in the lines, okay? So I'm going to finish filling in my red, and then I'm going to be ready to start my next color, okay? So generally I would want all your 3 primaries done before you move on to mixing. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to start mixing right away to show you the first section. So you can choose whichever section you want. I'm going to start with the oranges section here because I already have red in my palette. So I'm going to put my brush off to the side because I don't need to wash it yet. So then I'm going to be mixing an orange color, which means I'm going to use some yellow. So I'm going to dip or put some yellow right into the palette. And again, just using a small amount. And then my goal is to have equal amount of red on my brush to add to the yellow. So I'm going to add that red that I had on my brush, stir it all up. I can adjust as necessary, so if I see my orange is looking a little light, I'll add another little dip of red until I get a pretty good middle color orange that looks like as close to an orange as I can get. And I'm going to paint that in using the same brush technique and staying in the lines. Okay, so now I've got a pretty good orange. Might not show well on the camera, so we'll hold it a little closer to see. And so now my goal is to take my orange and turn it into a yellow orange. And then do the same thing, turn the yellow orange to the red orange. So I'm going to start with my lighter color first, which is the yellow orange. And I'm going to take my existing orange in the palette, and I'm going to just take a couple drips, not a whole lot of paint. Again, not filling up this section with paint, it's still at the bottom. And we'll see what I get just with a couple drips of the yellow. So now I'm looking at my orange to my yellow orange, and I want to make sure that when I paint in my yellow orange, it should look lighter than the orange. So if it's lighter, then I know it's going to count as correct. Okay, so now I have a yellow orange in my palette, and I have a red in my palette. And so I want to change this to a red orange. So I'm going to use a lot of red. So instead of taking this red and moving it there, and instead of using new red, I'm going to just take what's already on my brush, a little bit of that yellow orange on my brush, not a whole lot, because I don't want to turn this to orange. I want to go to red orange. And then I'm going to stir that into the red. All right, so now it looks like I've got a pretty good red orange. So we're going to see how it looks on paper. Okay, so now I've got my middle section done there between my yellows and my reds. And so I should see, and it'll change a little as it dries, but I should see a difference between the yellow orange should be lighter than the orange, and then the red orange should be darker than the orange. Okay, and I definitely should see a difference between the red and the red orange too, which is hard to see on camera, but you should see the red orange should be just lighter than your red. At this point, I would be ready to wash my brush with a water basin after finishing the oranges. And so notice I'm just using that rippled edge there, and if you hear that sound, you know you're pushing too hard on your brush, and it's going to wreck the hairs on the brush. So just very gentle. And then I'm going to still see paint on the ferrule, that metal part of the brush. So I'm just going to wipe that off on my paper towel, and then make sure that my brush is also dry. So just dry that brush off before I start my next section. And I can either do my purples or I can do my green section, whichever you prefer. At the end of the class hour, I'm going to make sure that my paint lids, the little caps, I'm going to twist those so that they shut all the way. And then I'm also going to just take some paper towel and wipe off the wet paint on the lid before I put it back in the container. And I'm going to do that to all my paints. Definitely make sure they're closed.